What is up, you guys? It is your favorite, hopefully, macro data refiner, miscellaneous Gab. Due to the fact that I literally can't think about anything other than Severance, we're here for a mid-week discussion video talking about reintegration and revisiting Petey from season 1. What can we learn from everything he said to predict what Mark is about to go through? Grab some Christmas mints and let's get started. In episode 1, Mark heads into the office. One of the first things that he mentions is that Petey had been sniffling the day before.
Petey was sniffling yesterday.
Right away, he and Dylan are sort of postulating on if Petey is even going to be in the office or not. Dylan is concerned because he's so close to finalizing his Tumwater file. And I kind of wonder if all these files are just different names of reanimated bodies that Lumon is working on reprogramming. Either way, there's a lot of uncertainty on where Petey is. Petey was the chief of the MDR team before Mark took over. Now, Milchick summons Mark, brings him into Miss Cobell's office. The board is on the speaker, mumbling. There's no Natalie there to translate. Mark goes in, says his name. We hear that static. Other than that, there's no communication. But we know one thing, that Petey is no longer with the company and Mark is now the new chief of MDR. One thing that is unclear if Petey quit or he was let go. Mark asks more questions and Milchick says that would be a violation of the employee's privacy. I know this is kind of low on the Lumon torturing their employees scale, but just telling you that your friend has disappeared without any explanation, they're essentially unalive. That to me is cruel and unusual punishment. It got me thinking really largely on what happens when severed employees just die of natural causes. If they are in a car accident or they do get sick, do they ever disclose what happened to the people? I would think so if it's other circumstances other than a retirement party. Also, one other question I have is if a Lumon employee just randomly were to die of a natural cause, would they all need to go into their brain and drill out the chip? Because Petey collapsed in a convenience store and was taken to a non-Lumon hospital, they didn't really have control over that. So Mark goes about his life in the first episode. He goes to Devon's house and the next morning he mentions that he saw a quote businessman watching him. Devon kind of plays it off saying it might be a vagrant from the bar or something, but we know of course it's Petey. The fact that he mentions businessman shows that Petey is still in his work attire, either because he was planning on going to work that day, got freaked out and disappeared, maybe because he was starting to get paranoid, or he was hallucinating too much. He was clearly uncertain about what was going on. We know that he's watching Mark to try to get a message to him. So then Mark and Petey meet at Pip's diner. If you recall, Mark goes to Pip's diner because he gets a free gift card since his innie was hit on the head. The first thing that Petey says to Mark is,
"Hi kids, what's for dinner?"
"Hi kids, what's for dinner?" Which is funny because that is actually the first thing that Irving said in episode 1.
"Hi kids, what's for dinner?"
Petey explains some of the situation to Mark and Mark asks if he lodged a complaint with the company. Petey says something really interesting, which is, "I tried that and you tried that too. So did you." Right away, we realize that Mark has lodged some sort of internal complaint. The innie Mark we see before he gets rebellious seems quite content. So we wonder, has Mark been somehow reset? Original innie Mark was quite rebellious. What if his original innie already figured out something about Miss Casey or broke the rules in some way and they had to reset him? Petey confirms that he has become, quote, unsevered, which is, I guess, their way of saying reintegrated, and that Grainer is after him. Grainer being the evil, all-hovering security guard who is offed by Ragabe in season 1. Petey says, "Nothing down there is what they say. If something happens to me, the things I know need to stay known. I prefer it be by a friend." So one super interesting thing here is Mark says, "Are we friends in there?" Petey says, "I'm your best friend and you're one of my good friends." If Petey has better friends in Lumon, why wouldn't he go tell them? The fact that he's watching Mark, that he's really trying to tell Mark something, makes me wonder if the outside rebellion against Lumon has selected Mark as maybe their hope just as much as Lumon has selected innie Mark as being so essential and integral to the success of Project Cold Harbor. He always talks about Ragabe and the Force as them. He He doesn't just say her, Ragabe. It's clearly this bigger movement. So clearly they know the truth as well. I think at this point, maybe Petey realized that it was too late for him, either because he's so freaked out that people are following him, or he's begun the sickness and he knows that his time is limited, so that now everything that he does is really to pass on that information to somebody else. He gives Mark a card that is a happy birthday niece card. He writes in the card, "We used to wonder what kind of men we were on the outside." He thinks that only a monster could do this to someone, especially if it was someone who could do this to himself. And he said, "We're not monsters, Mark. If you don't want to know what's going on down there, I won't force it. But if you do, there's an address on the back of this card. Go alone and you'll find the beginning of a very long answer." In episode 2, Mark polishes a photo of the MDR team and looks concerned and sad, maybe realizing for the first time that his friend is gone. He then proceeds to take all the photos with Petey in them off the desk and hide them away in the storage cabinet. Then he goes to the greenhouse. He has been living in this greenhouse because he thinks the people at Lumon are after him. Later, when Miss Cobelvig talks about how she thinks that Petey was possibly reintegrated, the board and Natalie are like, "Lady, that's crazy. Surely someone in your position should know that that is impossible." So either the board knows, but they don't want Cobelvig to know, and they're sending Grainer to watch Petey, or Petey is actually not being followed. Nobody knows he's reintegrated, and the paranoia and the hallucination is just a side effect of the reintegration sickness. Maybe if he hadn't had that paranoia, then he could have still stayed going into Lumon undetected. Petey does mention that he is the first person who's ever been reintegrated. He also saw Miss Cobelvig in Mark's house and freaked out and ran away because he was getting flashbacks of her as Miss Cobel, Miss Selvig. So maybe he just saw someone who looked like Grainer and thought that Grainer was after him, and really maybe the people at Lumon were none the wiser to what had been going on. He mentions in the greenhouse that he was reintegrated 2 weeks ago. So unless the reintegration effed up his mind, and unless like Lumon has something going on with time, the reintegrated Petey has been able to go inside of Lumon because he was able to draw that map. Petey says that there's evidence of people living there. Mark says, "What are we actually working on?" Petey says that he still doesn't know. He says they separate us from other departments and he doesn't know how many they are. So this falls in line with that art propaganda, the suspicion between the departments. This goes back to one of the first things he told Mark, which is nothing is as it seems. Petey suffers from a headache. He says that living in a cold greenhouse doesn't help. We hear later from Ragabe, even in season 1, that Petey didn't follow her instructions. We hear this again in season 2 when she's about to reintegrate Mark. Maybe Petey had like a doctor's orders of a warm bath and chicken soup in order to aid in the reintegration. You think this man who's probably not sleeping, not eating, living in a greenhouse in the middle of winter because he went on the run, because he was so scared of Lumon, that was ultimately his demise. Petey shows Mark a map of the floor. We see MDR. He says, "We're here because we're not all there." He says some people might live here, drawing these houses. So maybe these are the people that he mentioned never leave Lumon. Maybe these are people like the goat people, who many have speculated actually do longer stints of time down on the Sever floor, like they're 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off or something. So Petey reaffirms that he's the first one who's been through the severance procedure. Mark asks what happens that's so bad down there. Mark really doesn't want to believe this. Petey says there's this room. He seems visibly upset and shaken at the thought. He then produces a tape. Here, Mr. Milchick torturing Mark, making him recite that lines of atonement they have them do for at least hours in the workday, maybe even longer if they are indeed messing with time and keeping them down there for longer. Many people have wondered, how did Petey get this tape? How did he get the map? Are the code detectors faulty? The Lexington letters are like a whole other video. If you want me to make a video on them, I can. There's sort of this idea that the code detectors are taken down for maintenance and they're not always working. The only time that we see the code detectors working is when Helly brings a note into the elevator in season 1. The only thing is she announces it to everyone, and we know Lumon is listening. She says, "That doesn't sound real. I'm gonna try it." And she runs to the elevator with a note. So it wouldn't be that hard to trigger that alarm when she's announcing what she's going to do. So either Petey was able to smuggle these things out himself, or someone else who is a non-severed employee gave these items to him. I'm inclined to think that maybe the tape of Milchick torturing Mark was given to Petey. After all, it's of Mark. We know that Milchick records the session, so perhaps Ragabe or somebody on the inside, someone working for the resistance was able to smuggle out these tapes, maybe this was played to Audi Petey, and this is what kickstarted that domino effect of the reintegration, because he's like, what is going on? I'm no longer ignorant. I need to figure out what's happening down there. The code detectors must be faulty in some way. Maybe they can only detect written words or paragraphs, because after all, Milchick was concerned that Dylan was able to sneak something out of Lumon, which is why he triggered the OTC. Anyway, Mark brings Petey home. Honestly, looking back and knowing what happens to Petey, this actually made me so much more sad than when I watched it the first time, really seeing how much he's struggling, how scared he is, how paranoid he is. Petey gets a call but doesn't answer it. Now, I saw this person on Reddit who thinks that maybe Petey already knew it was too late. He was so paranoid at this time. Perhaps Ragabe is calling him to check up on him, that he doesn't trust anyone, or maybe he wants to keep Ragabe safe because he knows or suspects that people are watching him. He sees two versions of himself. He's completely disoriented, hallucinating, even bleeding. He has more flashbacks of himself at work. He then tells Mark later that it's like having two different lives stuck together, but the relativity is fucked. He said that his first day at Lumon goes as far back as his 5th birthday. All he knows is he's been reintegrated for 2 weeks. That means he's had 2 weeks to be down on the Lumon floor. I think it's been shorter, but I do think it was long enough for Cobelvig to recognize that some things were maybe not right. Mark says, what do you want from me? Petey says, don't you want to know what you do down there? Mark says, not really. Mark is miserable for all the hours that he's not at Lumon, so he doesn't really want to be miserable for more than that. Petey says, what if you're murdering people for 8 hours a day? What if that is what macro refinement is doing? Petey said, I found a department where people don't get to leave. So this is interesting because he said maybe people live down here, and on his map there's no labeled thing where this is where the people don't get to leave. He then says, I don't know if Irving is going to walk in.
Or if Irving's gonna walk in.
At first, we write this off of like, this is just him hallucinating, thinking he's at work. Even Mark says, you're not at work. You're not at the office right now. What if Petey has met Audi Irving? And Audi Irving, we know he's involved. We know something is going on. So he's scared of Irving. Or maybe he just thinks because Irving is such a stickler to the rules on the inside that he would be like that on the outside. So maybe Petey was reintegrated. Maybe Audi Irving tried to contact him, and maybe that freaked him the F out, thinking that Lumon was after him. What if? I feel like there's a double meaning there. Let me know what you think. We see Mark kind of falling asleep to the news. Now, I loved watching this, knowing what we do now. Natalie is on TV. Of course, she is the best corporate PR person. Maybe she's an AI, maybe she's a human, but either way, she's having one of those pundit discussions with someone who's talking about a severed employee who got pregnant 1 month into her employment. Actually paints a pretty dire picture. If employees are getting graped down there and getting impregnated, what the heck? Behind Mark is a red and blue beta fish. We know that betas can't be integrated into the same tank or they'll kill each other. Very symbolic. They're kept in 2 different sides of the tank. Red and blue are often seen symbolizing the inside and outside. But of course, as it all comes together, we're seeing a lot more purple in season 2, the 2 worlds colliding, which culminates with Mark getting reintegrated. If Petey was at work for 2 weeks, how did he know how to act? Was he coached by Ragabe? Or is there somebody else, somebody who deals with MDR employees on the regular who might have been able to coach him on how to act? Back at Lumon, Natalie comes in with the board to talk about Peter Kilmer / Petey. Cobelvig mentions, I don't mean to be an alarmist, but before his departure, there were signs of possible reintegration. Natalie kind of flames her for this. She says that the board will not consider reintegration as a possibility. What's all the suspicion with Petey then? If they're really not willing to believe he was reintegrated, then what do they think happened to him? Do Lumon employees just randomly freak out and go missing? Was he walking into the parking lot that day and then saw Irving or Grainer and just ran the other way because of his paranoia? Now, as Petey starts to go crazier and really disintegrate, we hear the overlay of Peter's words. Should you tame the tempers as I did mine, then the world shall become but your appendage. It is this great and consecrated power that I hope to pass on to all of you, my children. Not only is that a creepy line, but I feel like it's so packed with meaning meaning the innies and the outies are kind of opposites of each other in a way. Perhaps the innie has more balance of the other tempers that the outie is deficient in, and vice versa. What happens when these two halves come together? Now, what does this mean for Mark? I am hoping, because Mark is so determined to see Gemma, that he follows Rugabe's instructions to a T. Whatever she says, I am hoping to hear, to God, that Mark follows the instructions. I also hope Petey's map comes into play and Mark is able to try to retrace it. He has that map of where people may live. Because Petey said, I think people never leave, maybe that's the first place he goes to look for Gemma, hoping that he finds Gemma really soon. This season means business, so I'm hoping he goes straight for Gemma, towards that area where he thinks people live. Either way, there's so much mystery, so many questions to be answered. What do you think? What is the real purpose? Has Mark been reset? Let me know what you think in the comments. I can't wait for this week's episode. I love hearing all of your theories. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.